Producer TCustomz, TCustomz.com. A couple days ago I released a new hip-hop, mellow, smooth kind of hip-hop instrumental titled Your World. I actually got a pretty good response on Facebook and YouTube and different type of beat than I normally do. I did contain samples. I had a couple different samples that I incorporated into it. Also incorporated my own instrumentation. What's cool about this track, other than the sound's a little bit different than what I typically do, it's the process that went into this was a little bit different. And I actually had a couple people asking, can you do a breakdown or step-by-step video? And I was thinking this would be a pretty good one to show, just because it's not me typically just taking a regular sample, chopping it up and playing it across the pads or across the keys. There was a little more that went into it than just that. So let me get into it. I'll step you through the process of how I got the samples together, and then just step you through how everything came together. So what was different for this beat in terms of the process, the way I approached this beat? Well, I was kind of at a time where I was doing a lot of sample tracks, and again, this track does contain samples, but I'm almost looking at this more as a composed type of beat, and I'll explain to you why here in just a second. As I've mentioned before, as I dig through samples, whether I'm going through a vinyl record or I'm going through a digital album, I typically don't revisit samples. Maybe I find a sample that really strikes me right away. I find a bunch of pieces that I want to use, I'll start chopping it up and start making a beat right away. And then other times, I may take one sample and start using it, and then I'll find maybe other pieces within another record or something that I like, that intrigue me, but right away I'm not really sure what I would do with it. I don't really have something in mind of how I would chop and rearrange it, but there's certain pieces and elements that definitely I want to revisit. So what I'll do many times is take those particular samples and put those in a miscellaneous sample folder, which again I've talked about. Sometimes I'll put the entire sample, and then sometimes I'll actually cut little pieces that I can use for records in the future. For this case, I actually had a full-length song, and in the intro of this song, it had a single kind of like synth note, had a little bit of stereo effect to it, but it was an isolated note, and it was something that I thought to myself, the rest of this record I'm not really that interested in sampling. It seemed a little too cluttered, but that beginning, it had that open note. So what I did was I cut that note out and I loaded it into an Ableton sampler. And similarly, the way I demonstrated in the bass sample pack demonstration, when you take a single note, load it into a sampler, whether you're on Ableton or you're in some other software or hardware that has a sampler, you can take a single note, like in this case a synth note, and now play it across the keys. Once I had that note loaded into the sampler, I have essentially an instrument I can now work with. I'm essentially making a virtual instrument. I don't have the same manipulation and same flexibility as I would over a sound that's maybe in a virtual instrument, because this is just straight audio. But I kind of look at this as like creating your own custom patch to an extent. So before I get into the actual sample, the chord progression that I came up with, I first laid down a drum track, which I'm taking a pretty classic drum break. It's pretty standard. I've used it before. And I started with the 4-bar loop. And then many times what I like to do is actually add additional drum samples to that break. So I've added a kick and a snare that kind of underlay to the drum break and just give it a little more substance, really, I guess is the best way to explain it. Once I had the basic drum groove, then I was wanting to get into the sample that I had loaded into my sampler, and I want to start creating some kind of chord progression or figure out what would sound cool and whatever. So next I just started experimenting with some different chord progressions. Next, I actually went back into that same miscellaneous sample folder. I found a sample that I had set aside from a group called Atlantic Star. You might be familiar with them. And basically, I was looking just for some additional either instrumentation or vocal chops or anything. So here's a little preview of what the record sounds like. And then later in the record, I found this piece that I really liked. And that's kind of where the title of the track came. It says, "I was your world." And then I used that vocal chop pretty much throughout the entire chorus, what ended up being the chorus on the track. And so here's what it sounds like with that vocal chop. One of the main things to keep in mind is when you're incorporating multiple samples into a single beat is the key of the samples, because typically you're not going to have two samples that are in the exact same key. It's possible, but typically they'll be in two different keys, and so you just got to make sure that when you're pitching and transposing and time shifting and doing all that kind of stuff that you're getting everything to match up and the melodies make sense together. Next, what I did was I loaded in a couple virtual instruments. I'm using Omnisphere, no shock there. I actually pulled from electric piano, Rhodes kind of keys. I stacked two different instruments on top of each other. And so now I have a sound like this. And so at this point, I'm looking for instrumentation that's going to complement the original chord progression that I have. I just experimented with these keys, different variations. I did a bunch of trial runs, did a bunch of different recordings, and found different pieces that I liked of just stuff I was playing on improv, and I just kind of collectively put it all together. That's the additional Rhodes or electric piano that I'm using on the hook. I went and revisited that Atlantic Star sample, the one that I originally pulled that vocal stab from, and found another piece that I've kind of filtered throughout the verse, kind of give some extra variation. And so it's just a really subtle chop, but it just gives a little variation to the verse part. Next is the bass, and I'm actually using a Trillion patch that I tweaked and customized and filtered and compressed. It's a vintage electric guitar, bass guitar patch that I'm using, and it's a very simple bass line, something that just stuck to essentially the root note of whatever chord I was playing. Add a little vinyl static that I had recorded from one of my records, just to give it a little extra grit and dirtiness, I guess. But other than that, those were essentially all the elements that went into it. I mean, it wasn't a very complex beat in terms of the number of tracks. It really just came down to finding the right sounds to go together, then kind of arranging it and making sure that everything flows and makes sense for like a song structure. So that's pretty much it. Thanks again for the support. Let me know your comments below. Anything else you want to share, feel free. Like, share, subscribe to the channel. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks again for watching, and stay inspired. Peace.